Something that annoys me about Copilot Studio is you can't use a SharePoint list as knowledge. That's right, if you go over here to the knowledge section, click on add knowledge and then select SharePoint, you can put in the URL of a SharePoint site, but it's only going to grab you information from that SharePoint site's pages or its document libraries, not going to grab any information from a list. So what do? Well, what we can do is we can create an action that gets information from the SharePoint list using natural language, and it's actually a flow underneath it all. When the user asks a question about the SharePoint list, it's going to use this action to return a set of filtered SharePoint list results. And the SharePoint list that we're going to be working with today is the office location SharePoint list. So in this list, there's all sorts of information that you would expect to see about an office and its location, like the street address, the city, and the state. But we've also got other types of information over here on the right, like the head count, which is a number, and the lease end date, which is a date. So because we have text and numbers and dates to work with, this should make it a pretty interesting example. Let's go ahead and give this SharePoint Copilot agent a try. I'll start by asking the first question, show me all the offices in the state of Illinois. And let's see what gets output by the agent. Hey, look there's the Schaumburg office and the Chicago office. 1 and 2. That's perfect, right? They're both from Illinois. Let's ask another question. Give me a list of all the offices with more than 200 people. And remember, my SharePoint list said head count, not people. Look, it still figured it out, right? There we go. We've got the Albany office, the Bronx office, and the Minneapolis office. So Albany, Bronx, and Minneapolis. They've got 250, 375, and 425. Let's give this one more try. Tell me the offices which have a lease date in 2026. So now we're working with dates instead of numbers or text. And the SharePoint Copilot agent is going to get it right again. We've got the Albany office and the Chicago office, Albany and Chicago. And the lease end date is in 2026. So now that you're all excited and I've proved that this works, let's go ahead and build this Copilot Studio agent. Today we're building the entire Copilot Studio agent from scratch. So we'll start off here on the home screen. We'll navigate over to the Create section and click New Agent. Let's get this prompt right here to configure and get straight to the good stuff. We're going to call our agent the SharePoint List Query Agent. Let's make it nice and generic. For our description, we're going to use this description right here. So the description is, the agent should return a list of matching SharePoint list items from a specified SharePoint list and filter the results per the user's specifications. Hey, that's me. The results should be returned as a bulleted list of items. We also need to give our Copilot agent instructions so it knows how to behave. Here's the instructions that we're going to use. The agent will ask the user to choose a SharePoint list. When the user responds, the agent will verify that the SharePoint list exists. If the SharePoint list exists, the agent will ask the user to input search criteria as natural language, so just as if they were speaking. The natural language search criteria will be converted into a SharePoint REST API filter query by the agent. We'll get into more about what that means later. And any results matching the SharePoint REST API filter query will be returned to the user in chat. So that's what our agent is all about. The next thing that we need to do is create this agent. So we'll click the Create button, and this will just take a moment while Copilot Studio sets up our agent. And here we go. So now we can go ahead and add our first action. We go over here to the Actions menu and click on Add an Action. And the type of action that we want to create is a Power Automate flow. So we'll hit New Power Automate Flow. Now for our Power Automate flow, what we want to do is add a couple of inputs to this trigger. The first input that we want to add is the SharePoint site URL. And this is going to be the address of the SharePoint site that we want the Copilot agent to interact with. And yes, we're putting these inside the trigger because we want to build something that's reusable for several SharePoint lists down the road. Another piece of information that we need is the SharePoint list name. And we also want to take in the user query. So this is the bit of natural language that the user is going to ask to get information from the list. Like, get me all of the offices in the state of Illinois. That's what's going to go in the user query section. Next, what we need to do is set up our SharePoint list, because without our SharePoint list, our agent isn't going to have anything to get information from, right? So I've made this SharePoint list in advance. It's called the Office Locations List. And you're going to need a couple of columns. You're going to need street address, city, state, and zip code. These are all text columns, and you can go ahead and populate them with your own information, your own sample information. We have a head count column, which is a number type of column. This is the amount of people who work in the office. And we also have a lease end date column, which is a date. Make sure that's a date only and doesn't include the time. And so this is the list that we're going to have our Copilot Studio Agent talk to and get information out of. Now we'll go back to the Power Automate flow. The next action that we're going to add is a send HTTP request to SharePoint. And there it is right there. And this is a standard action in Power Automate. It's not premium, don't worry. That allows us to do a good many things that the SharePoint connector doesn't by default. For the site address, we are going to add in custom item here. And we're going to use the input from the list. My gosh, this menu is small. SharePoint site URL. And this is the site that we're going to work with. What we're going to do in this action is we're going to get the columns from the SharePoint list and their data types. So on this SharePoint list that we were just looking at, we want to get the names of these columns, street address, city, state, so on and so forth, but we also want to get whether they're a text column or a number column or a date column, because that's going to help our agent down the road craft a filter query to be able to get these items out of the list. So I've got that filter query half set up already, and I'm going to just copy it and paste it into the action right here. So here we're using the REST API and getting the list, the same list name that's here in the trigger, and then we're going to get its fields. So here you can see the word fields. We only need a couple columns out of this request and its response, right? What it returns, the title, the internal name, and type is string. So these are the column names and the type of column that they are. And we're also filtering out can be deleted equals true. And the reason that we want to do that is because SharePoint has all of these extra hidden columns that are included in the metadata that we don't need to feed into the rest of our flow, right? We want to reduce what's getting output here to as small as possible. One more thing we need to do is to add a couple of headers here. So we'll use the accept header and application JSON. And then we're going to go ahead and give this flow a run, but I guess we should give it a name, right? Let's call it get SharePoint list items using natural language. Hit the save button, and then we're going to see what this action outputs so that we can all understand what it's doing. Now that the flow is saved, we can hit the test button, and we will hit the continue button right here. Needs a couple bits of information. So here we're getting the SharePoint site URL, pasting it in. We'll type in the name of the list, which is Office Locations, and then we'll type in a user query, even though it's not being used yet. Let's say, give me all the offices in the state of Illinois. Run the flow. Flow ran successfully. Of course it did. And we can see that the output of this flow action down here includes street address as a text, city as a text, state, zip code, and then head count as a number, and the send date as a date time. So that's perfect. That's absolutely what we needed. Let's name this SharePoint action before we move on and just title it so that we know what it does, SP list columns. Then we can move on to the next one here. The next thing we'll do is prompt the column and data type information output by the SharePoint REST API and reduce the amount of columns in that array. There's too much information in there. There's a little bit of extra stuff. And later on, we're going to use a prompt action. We just don't want to pass all that extra information into the prompt. Here I will add a parse JSON action to help us work with the output of the previous action here. And let's grab the values. So here it just says body, but we're going to need to manipulate this a bit. Notice I copied and pasted. And then we are going to add the value column at the end right there. I'll hit save. The other thing we need for this parse JSON action is we're going to need a sample of what the previous action's output looked like. So let's go back to our flow history over here. We're going to grab it by going to the latest flow run. We'll hit new view. And we can go and open up that action once again and see its outputs. Here we want to get the information on the value. So I'll highlight everything in these square brackets all the way down, copy it here into generate from sample, and then click done. It does say that the schema is required. That's funny because that's just what I've given it. So let's give this one more try here. And I think this should be fine once we save the flow. Yep, that's right. So no problem there. Next, we're going to add a select action to the flow. And this is also going to help us transform the data and get just the columns that we need. We're going to take the output from the previous parse JSON action, and we'll give this a nice name. We're going to select the internal name columns, title, and type as string. In the map area of the action, we're going to type those column names once again, title, internal name, and type as string. And now because we used the parse JSON action previously, we can just use dynamic values to fill in the right-hand side of this table. So here we will pick title, we will pick internal name, and we will pick type as string. Great. The last thing that we need to do before we can pass these records into our prompt action that we're going to create is change the data type from an array to text, because prompts like to intake text and not arrays. So I'm going to rename this action, and we will grab the output of that select action before it and give our flow a test again. I'll hit test automatically with the recent trigger, hit save and next, and then we should be able to see what happened when I add these actions to the flow. Pretty fast, right? So after everything that we did, here you can see there is a title, an internal name, and a type as string, text, 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 number, date, time. That's perfect, right? That's all the information that our prompt that we're going to build is going to need. So speaking of that, it is time to build our prompt. And what our prompt is going to do is it's going to take in the user's query from right here in the flow. It's going to take in the information about the SharePoint list, and it's going to use them to craft a SharePoint REST API OData filter query. Well, that's kind of a mouthful, right? But what it will do is allow us to filter this SharePoint list based on the user's natural language query. Let's open up our AI prompts editor and create a brand new prompt. Let's click on build your own prompt right here. All good prompts have a name, so we'll call this prompt generate URI to get list items from SharePoint REST API. That's looking pretty good here. On the left-hand side is where we want to write our query. We'll bump up the power of the model from basic to standard. That's GPT 4.0. And then I'm going to copy and paste a query in here, and we're going to read it together. And instead of query, I meant to say prompt right there. Here we go. So here we can see that the objective of this prompt is to generate a value URI for use in the Power Automate action, send an HTTP request to SharePoint. That's important that the prompt knows that we're trying to create a HTTP request for Power Automate. Then it gives it a few more instructions about how to structure that API request. Here is the base of the API request where it's going to fill in the SharePoint list name. Then it explains it should use OData filter query based on the user's input and what is provided down here to craft that. Then it's also going to use a select query, and you'll remember from Power Automate before, what it does is takes all of the columns output by the SharePoint REST API and just spits back exactly what's needed, right? There might be 100 columns, but we're just going to spit back all of the columns that the user's interested in. And then finally, return a single line of text containing the complete valid SharePoint REST API URI. There is a couple of requirements here. Use only SharePoint REST API syntax, pretty important. Do not include additional text or explanations in the output. Use the URI, ensure the URI rather is properly encoded if necessary. Compare columns in the filter query to data of the same type, and do not use the year function, month function, or day function to query dates in the OData filter. Use a date range comparison instead. And that's a very specific requirement because I found when I was testing, this was something that would frequently trip the prompt up. You might have a question though, like how did I know about the SharePoint REST API? And information about that is actually in Google Chrome, so in MS Learn rather. So SharePoint REST API filter queries, we can look at that in Google. There we go, there's the Microsoft Learn page. And if you scroll down it, there's all sorts of awesome information about how do you create a REST API query. But the prompt already knows this, so it's awesome. We don't need to do that for ourselves. We do want to put in a little bit of inputs. At the bottom here, we need to add the SharePoint list name. So this is text, and we'll call it SharePoint list name, just like this. And our list name is office locations. User filter query. So for the user filter query, that's the natural language which the user is going to ask. Hey, I have a question. Can you get the answer from the SharePoint list? So we'll call this user filter query. And for our sample query, let's do get me all of the offices in the state of Illinois. Then we also need the SharePoint list columns. We're going to go ahead and click add here, SharePoint list columns. And that's what we just got out of the Power Automate flow. So I'm going to go back to my flow runs history, hit back and back right here, go grab my latest run, and I will grab this information right here for our sample query. Go ahead and click close. And so I think I've got this all right here, GPT 4.0 model, and that's perfect. We're going to hit test the prompt. There we go. Perfect. So the API response came back, get me all the office location items, state equals Illinois, and these are the columns that we want to see. They're the exact same columns as what's inside of the SharePoint list. So I have a feeling that this is going to work out just perfect. Here I will hit save, and now the AI prompt is going to be available in our Power Automate flow, available to use. So let's go back on over to the flow that we were creating and open that up once again. Get on to the next thing, which is adding our prompt action to the flow. Here we need to look for AI Builder, and we need to look for create text with GPT in a prompt. Create text. There we go. There's a lot of prompt actions there, my gosh. Then we're going to go and find the prompt action that we created. So I think it started with generate URI to get list items. There we go. There's two kind of similar ones, right? We're going to input the SharePoint list name, and you'll remember that's actually coming from our trigger. So SP list name. We're going to get the user's query. So that's the natural language that the user will talk to the bot with. And then the SharePoint list columns. And that's from the latest flow action right there. We're gonna hit the save button. And now we've added the prompt to our action. It's gonna give us a warning right here, but we can safely ignore it. This is just giving us a suggestion that we don't need to follow. Now we're going to go and really see the magic happen right here, because we're going to pass that query that was loaded in from the GPT prompt, and we're going to pass it into this SharePoint REST API action. We're actually going to get those list items finally. Okay, so we're looking for the SharePoint site URL. Clicking OK, so it's there as custom value. We do want to use the get method, and here we want to use text from create text with the GPT using a prompt action. Because I really like to name things properly, I'm going to call this get list items. Then we're going to run this one more time. So we'll hit manually. We're going to get that SharePoint site address once again. Yep, I know there's a warning there. We can ignore it. SharePoint list names, office locations, and get me all of the offices in the state of Illinois. That's our favorite question today. Hit the done button. And our flow ran successfully. Yeah, we got it. First try. So we can see we created the text with the GPT prompt here, and we'll see the raw outputs. It's really hard to see, but the API request was spit out right there. But the important part is in this next action, we have all of the results. So we have the office at Schaumburg, Illinois, and we have the office in Chicago, Illinois. That's absolutely perfect. I'm going to copy this body right here because I might need it later. Great. So let's go ahead and get into the home stretch here, because we got the SharePoint list items, but now what we want to do is we want to send those back to the Copilot in this respond to actions agent step right here. Ooh, they changed that from Copilot to agent. Nice. So what we do is we hit select right here. We want the select action, and we want to remove the metadata. Remove metadata. We want to get the items from the previous action. And again, we're only working with the body right there, so it doesn't really tell us everything that we need to know. But from the items that we saw just a moment ago, we know that they're sitting under the D property, just a good memory, I swear, and the results property. So if you need to back the video up there for a moment just to go see what properties those items are sitting under. And then what we want to do is we want to remove the metadata property. So we hit switch to text mode over here. We erase all of this stuff. And then we will write a quick formula. We're going to use the remove property formula, and we're going to look at each item in that array of objects that just came back. And then we want to remove the metadata column. So it has 2 underscores here in metadata. There we go. That will do the trick. And because we're passing the information back to Copilot, well, the next thing we have to do is change it from an array to text. Give that action a name, convert list items object to text, and put the output right there. So now the array is converted to text. Great. Finally, need to add an output right here. So we will just call this output, and it's going to be a text type. And we're going to output that from the previous compose action and hit save. There we go. Whew. Perfect. So now that we've created this Power Automate flow, which by the way, we can use again and again, it's great. You can just hook it up to your Copilot, add in any list name that you want, site URL. Now we got to go back to Copilot and hook it up there as an action. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go and finish this action right here and press the refresh button. And then it's going to show up over there. And it's going to be right here in the list. That's perfect. Get SharePoint list items using natural language MD. Okay, we're going to give this action a name. I kind of like it, but I want to give it something a little bit more descriptive for the Copilot so it knows what to do with it. So get matching SharePoint list items for Office locations. And the Copilot really relies on this description to know what to do. I do want to give it a little bit longer of a description, which says when the user asks a question about Office locations, use this action to return a filtered set of SharePoint list items. And that's really going to just kind of help it along. We do want to use the SharePoint site URL, user query, and list name that are right here. We're just going to go through one by one and fill these out. So we want to use the SharePoint site URL that we've been using all along and set it as a value. And we're going to hard code this. It's going to be my website, Matthew Devaney blog. Perfect. Click done. For the SharePoint list name, we're going to do something similar. We're going to make it set as a value. And then we're going to set that value to Office locations, which is the name of our list. For the user query, we need to make this a formula. We don't want to dynamically fill it with the best option, per the bot's judgment. We actually want to make this a formula. And that formula is going to be the last message formula. So we want to pass in all of the text from the user's chat window into that flow that we just built, into the prompt. It's going to create a filter query, send that to SharePoint, get the items, whole bunch of stuff, and return it right to us in Copilot Studio. Here we'll click done, and then I think we can go ahead and add this action. Ooh, might take a few seconds. That's okay. Gives me a minute to get my questions queued up right here. Now wait, there's one more thing before we go and start asking the Copilot questions. And it's very important that we go over here to the Overview tab and make sure that generative orchestration is enabled. So generative orchestration is going to make it easier for the Copilot to understand what is it that the user is asking the Copilot to do, and to know to trigger that agent action hooked up to the flow that we just built. So that being said, let's go ahead and ask our first question. Copilot, can you show me all the offices in the state of Illinois? Copilot says 2 offices, Schaumburg and Chicago office. That's awesome. Copilot, question number 2. Can you give me a list of all the offices with more than 200 people? Copilot says, yes, I can. 3 offices, Albany, Bronx, and Minneapolis. And Copilot, question number 3. Can you get me all of the offices leases ending in 2026? Copilot says, yes, I can. I've got the Albany and the Chicago office. So that's it. That's how you build a workaround to SharePoint lists knowledge in Copilot Studio.